Hi everybody, today we're going to talk about chapter 5, which is fetal development, and we're going to discuss what fetal development actually occurs and what's actually happening. So every one of us started out as two gametes or two sex cells. So we had an ova and we had a sperm, and those two had to come together. Those two unite to make that fetus. Human development is an ongoing process, not only when we're the gamete and the ova and the sperm come together, but human development also still goes on afterwards. After the baby's born, we got development throughout the pregnancy, we got development throughout after the pregnancy. And sometimes this can be affected by a lot of different factors. A lot of different things can come into play when we're thinking about when that ova and sperm come together. So to kind of differentiate what we kind of got going on, our body is made up of certain kinds of body cells. These are called soma cells. These are not your sex cells. These are just soma cells. And these soma cells make up organs in our body to make us who we are today. So these things come together. They form tissues. The tissues form organs. The organs form body systems. And then the body systems forms us. So we start out as this one little single united cell, and then everything starts to differentiate. Once each nucleus of the ova and each nucleus of the sperm have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 are autosomes, which are going to make us what we look like, what we're going to be, how things are going to go. And then we have one pair of sex chromosomes, which are going to determine whether it's a male or female. And then on these chromosomes, we have all the different types of genes that are going to determine, our height, predetermine our weight, our hair color, our eye color, our skin color, taste buds. All of those kinds of things are going to be differentiated onto those genes to determine who we're going to become. So gametes is kind of what we're talking about as far as with OB. So when you think about gametes, those are our sex cells, and they're found in the reproductive glands. That's going to be our ovaries for ova and our testes for males for the sperm. So thinking about though, each of those little gametes have 23 chromosomes. So our male sperm have 23, our ova have 23. So when those, I'm trying to get in the picture, how I use my hand. When those 23 come together, we get our 46. So that's how things happen. So if let's say one of the ova only had 22 chromosomes and the sperm had 23, when those come together, they're only going to have 45. Sometimes that's not really compatible with life, so a lot of times that baby will miscarry or there will be something wrong with the baby. So those are kind of how that kind of comes together. Okay, so different types of cellular division. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. But there's two types. There's mitosis and meiosis. Mitosis is the soma cells or the body cells. So mitosis is how our bodies regenerate new cells. Our bodies regenerate new cells every day. We get new skin cells. We get new mucous membrane cells. Things are sloughed off. We get new red blood cells. We get new white blood cells. And so mitosis, that's how they divide and make new things. Meiosis is where the gametes undergo two sequential cellular divisions. It's called gametogenesis, or how they become more. And I'll explain that just a little bit here in just a minute. But when you think about cellular division, males and females are very different. So spermatogenesis for males starts at puberty. So they start producing their sperm at puberty. That primary spermatocyte undergoes its first meiotic division. Then that second meiotic division happens and they become mature spermatozoa, able to penetrate an ova. So that's spermatogenesis. That happens at puberties for males. Females are a little bit different. Oophorogenesis starts before birth of the baby. So as soon as those 46 chromosomes come together and that embryo is decided that it's going to be a girl or a boy, well, actually a girl in this case, she is born with all of the ovas that she's going to have. So at birth, her ovaries contain primary ovocytes. They've already done their first meiotic division and they're just waiting for ovulation to start occurring. So women are born with all of the ovocytes that they're going to have. So thinking about that, something could happen in a little girl. Let's say that she is born with all the ovocytes that she's going to have, and at 5 years old, she gets cancer. And they have to do a lot of radiation, maybe a lot of chemotherapy. We know that that can kill out those ovocytes. So sometimes that's something that the doctor will take into consideration when you have a young child. So that's just something to think about. That second meiotic division does occur at ovulation. So at ovulation, you get that second meiotic division, and now that ovum is completed its cycle and it's ready for penetration from that mature sperm. So you can look at those on your own. But fertilization occurs when the sperm and the ova come together. Usually when that happens, it's going to take place in that outer section of the fallopian tube. So the ovary over here releases the egg, it goes into the fallopian tubes, and on that outer third of the fallopian tubes, kind of the outer third near that ovary, is where that fertilization is going to take place. So it's going to release out of the ovary in that ampule, in that outer third of the fallopian tube, kind of closer to the ovary, it's going to get fertilized. Now, as soon as it gets fertilized, a chemical change happens inside that ova, which puts a protective membrane around that fertilized ova and prevents any more sperm from penetrating that ova. So I want you guys to kind of know that the ova can survive, which is the female egg can survive 24 to 48 hours after it ovulates. So let's say it ovulates on a Monday morning at 8 o'clock. It can be good until Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock. So it's got a 24 to 48 hour window there that it can have ovulation. So when someone's trying to get pregnant, a lot of times they will buy the ovulation sticks. And what that is detecting is luteinizing hormone. What you talked about in some of the other videos. So luteinizing hormone comes in, and that luteinizing hormone kind of bathes that ova, and it releases that hormone in the urine. So a lot of women will take those sticks, and they can tell that if they have luteinizing hormone, they're going to ovulate within the next 24 to 48 hours. Then they know that they have a fertilization period. Where sperm can live a little bit longer. Sperm can live for a day up to 72 hours, so they can live up to 3 days. So it's important to let moms know if they're trying to use certain family practice things to prevent pregnancy, they need to know that sperm can live quite a long time in that vaginal canal, depending on a lot of other factors, vaginal acidity, all that kind of stuff. But just know those little tips there. Okay, so stages of fetal development. There are 3 stages. It's kind of important to know your stages of development. We got pre-embryonic, embryonic, and we got fetal. And going into the pre-embryonic stage, that starts at fertilization and lasts through that 2nd week. Conception usually occurs when that ovum is in that ampule of the outermost half of that fallopian tube. So it's kind of in the ampule. The zygote is formed. We call it a zygote now, or a zygote, whatever you want to call it. A zygote is formed, and it has a diploid number of chromosomes. Now, diploid means 2, so it's taken the sperm and the ova, and we've put them together now. So we had 2 things, put them together, and now they have 1 chromosome. Now, a lot of that starts happening, so you start with 1 little cell, and then it's going to start reproducing and making more and more and more. So you get that cleavage. Cleavage just means that it kind of goes like this and then forms another cell, forms another cell, forms another cell. 3 days after you've got fertilized, you have a morula, which that morula, it just comes a big ball of cells. 5 days after that it's been fertilized, you start to get blastocytes. Implantation usually occurs by the 10th day of fertilization. So you are pregnant before you ever know it because it has not implanted yet. Once it starts to implant, after fertilization, those blastocytes at 10 days start to burrow into that uterine lining. Once it burrows into that uterine lining, it starts to produce human chorionic gonadotropin, or I've always known it as beta HCG. That is the hormone that is detected in the urine for a positive pregnancy test. So it's the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, and when we pee on that stick, that's what it's detecting. Now, once that's burrowed into the uterine lining, we don't really call it the uterus anymore, we call it the decidua. So that endometrium is going to be called the decidua once you get pregnant. And this is kind of an important thing to think about. When the baby burrows into the uterus, we want it to burrow in to the posterior uterine wall. So you got your uterus kind of like a little pear-shaped. We want it to be in the posterior uterine wall. If it does not go into the posterior uterine wall and it implants down lower, like by the cervix, that can end up being a placenta previa, something like that. So we really want it to be in the posterior wall of the uterus. Some moms will get it in the anterior. It's harder to hear fetal heart tones if the placenta is in the front. So usually the placenta is going to be on the posterior uterine wall. That's where we really like it to implant, but it has a mind of its own sometimes and doesn't always plant there. So the embryonic stage is going to start at the 2nd week of fertilization, and it's going to go until the 8th week. So pre-embryonic is 0 to 2 weeks. Embryonic is going to be 2 to 8 weeks. Now, once it gets in that 2nd week, we're going to call it that embryo, and it's going to start to differentiate now, because up to this point, it's just been a big old ball of cells, hasn't really done anything, it's been making more and more and more, but it hasn't really done anything. So it's going to start coming into what we call germ layers. These germ layers is going to determine where it's going to go. And this is where sometimes a lot of things can happen during this time. So if you get a mom and she's 6 weeks pregnant and a lot of things are starting to happen, certain medications could cause things to change in this embryonic stage. But the 3 germ layers are the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. So the ectoderm, think of it as external. So it's kind of going to be where your skin, your hair, your nails, your sense organs, mucous membranes, kind of that outer layer. The mesoderm is the middle layer. So what's in the middle of us? Well, our skeleton, bone, cartilage, connective tissue, blood, that's kind of in the middle. The endoderm is inside, endoderm. That's going to be where all of our internal layers form, the linings of all of our body systems, all of that's going to start forming there. And so you can see if something doesn't start forming correctly, we could see like there could be a problem with fetal development someplace here. Sometimes if all these layers don't come together just like they're supposed to, sometimes your body will reject that and you will have an early miscarriage. So some people have miscarriages at 6 and 7 weeks and don't really even know that they're pregnant because something in this process did not occur like it should have occurred. So the fetal stage, now we're going from the 9th week all the way until the birth of the baby. The baby is now called the fetus. So pretty much now we got to do a lot of additional growth. We got to mature our organs. We got to develop our body systems. Things have got to start to work. So our neurological system has to develop, our urinary system, endocrine system. All of these things have to start growing and maturing. So just looking at this right here, this is our ovary. These are called fimbriae. These fimbriae want to come out and kind of grab that mature ovum. So it's going to come here. And so you can see this is the outer third of our fallopian tube. This is where your fertilization is going to occur. And once it's fertilized, it's going to kind of go through here. But let's say that you had something happen, you had scar tissue right here. That fertilized egg can't get through that scar tissue. So the fertilized egg just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And sometimes we'll call that an ectopic pregnancy. We'll talk about that more later on. But once it gets down in here, we want it to implant in that posterior uterus back there. That is the ideal place for it to implant. Because if it implants someplace else, it might cause some maternal complications as the pregnancy progresses. Okay, so how do we get those supportive structures to develop? How do we get things to start? So starting in the very beginning, we have something called a chorion and an amnion. So the chorion and the amnion. The chorion is going to develop from those trophioblasts. It's going to be the envelope that puts all the amnion, the embryo, and the yolk sac. It's a real thick membrane. It kind of has these little villas that kind of come out and kind of attach to things. It forms the embryonic fetal portion of that placenta. And we'll talk more about the chorion is that thick membrane. This is one of the things that we can go in and before a mom's ever even showing or before anything's going on, we can go in and take a little piece of that chorion and it'll tell us everything we need to know about that baby. The amnion is the second membrane. This is where all the amniotic fluid is. So amniotic fluid, because it gets more and more fluid as the baby gets bigger. So as the baby gets bigger, the baby swallows the fluid, it urinates and goes inside there as more fluid. So if the baby's not peeing or the urinary system didn't develop, there won't be much amniotic fluid in there. But the amniotic fluid should really be clear. It really shouldn't have any odor to it, and it should steadily get more and more and more as the pregnancy increases. The baby swallows it and excretes it, and we get more and more and more as our baby gets bigger. So by the time we get to delivery, we should have 1,000 milliliters of amniotic fluid. So that's about a liter of fluid. So that's quite a lot. And how much could that weigh? So think about that. That's part of what we have to take in consideration with the weight of our moms too, of how much that would weigh. Okay, so there's a lot of things that our amniotic fluid does. One, it's going to maintain a certain temperature. So it's going to maintain that nice, even temperature for that baby. We don't want it to get too hot. We don't want it to get, we don't want it to get too cold. So it maintains that good temperature in there for our babies. It prevents anything from sticking to the fetal skin. So the baby kind of just floats in there and it doesn't adhere to any of the skin. It allows the baby to grow symmetrically. So that means that the baby's going to arms and legs and head and back, everything is going to grow symmetrical. And the baby's just going to kind of bounce up and down. It also acts as kind of like a shock system for the baby. So if mom has a jolt, if mom falls, that baby's just kind of floating in there and it doesn't cause any problems with that baby. So it's kind of a cushion for that baby and for that umbilical cord to kind of protect that baby from anything. So that's pretty much the functions of our amniotic fluid. Make sure you understand those functions of that amniotic fluid and what it's doing. It does not nourish the baby in any way. It doesn't provide any nutrients for the baby. It just protects the baby and gives the baby these protective things. Okay, placenta. This is what's going to nourish your baby. This is what's going to give that baby what it needs to develop for the next 40 weeks. So the placenta has three main functions. The first one, it's going to transfer nutrients, oxygen, everything to our baby through our veins. We have the ava. We have I get confused too. 2 arteries and 1 vein. So all of the nutrients are going to transfer to our baby through the veins to our baby. It's going to have all of the nourishment that it needs through that umbilical vein. It's going to, part of the placenta will kind of act as a barrier for certain substances. But many things that mom takes in, baby's going to take in. So if mom takes in certain medications, baby's going to get medications. If mom takes in anything that is, not good for her, baby's going to get that too. If mom's a smoker, baby's a smoker. So we got to think about those kinds of things. The placenta will also function as an endocrine gland. It's going to produce hormones to keep that baby sustained. It's going to produce progesterone. it's going to produce estrogen, and it's going to produce HCG. It's going to keep all of those hormones at a certain level to keep that baby sustained. Until the placenta is completely developed, the mom's body will produce that progesterone, but once that placenta is formed, the placenta will start producing its own progesterone to keep that baby viable. Okay, so how does this happen? The placenta transfers this stuff, and then it's going to transfer all the oxygen, sugar, nutrients, everything baby needs. And then it's going to take it all back out through the umbilical arteries. And there's 2 of those. It's going to take it out through that way, put it back into mom's circulation, and mom's going to get rid of it for them. So your blood as mom is really rich in that oxygen and nutrients. Once it reaches that placenta, it gets into that placenta and kind of just goes across the placenta and gets into the umbilical cord through those little chorionic villi. And all of that exchange is going to take place there. Here's kind of how your placenta kind of happens here. So we got our maternal blood supply. Here's our chorionic villus. And this is how it's going to transfer over. And then it's going to transfer into our umbilical vein and go to our baby. And then it's going to transfer it back through our umbilical arteries to go back into circulation so mom can excrete all of that for the baby. So the baby doesn't have to do anything in there. Okay, so the umbilical cord. The umbilical cord is what we call our lifeline to our baby and mom. It's what's going to keep everything going. You have 2 arteries and you have 1 vein. So the arteries are going to carry blood away. So think artery starts with an A, it's going to go away. Where a vein is going to return it, is going to bring it to the fetus and give it everything that it needs. So the arteries are going to take it away, and 1 vein's going to bring it to the fetus. Wharton jelly is what kind of covers and cushions that umbilical cord. And when you see the umbilical cord, it's wrapped really tight, and it has your 2 arteries and 1 vein kind of wrapped real tight into it. It's usually about 22 inches. And then the cord usually goes into the center of the placenta. That can also be a problem if the cord is not in the center, or we have a placenta previa, which we'll get to some of those kinds of things. So all of those are kind of important. Intrauterine growth restriction. So think about intrauterine growth restriction. So this just means that our baby is not growing like it should. Well, we have to ask the question, why? Why is our baby not growing like it should? Well, we got to think of a couple things. 1, does the baby have a chromosomal abnormality? So when the sperm and the ova came together, did something chromosomally happen, and maybe they have a broken chromosome? And remember, once that ova and sperm come together, it forms that 46 chromosomes, and then it's going to divide and make 46 more, 46 more, 46 more. So if you only have 45, it's going to make 45 more, 45 more, 45 more, not 46. So we're going to get that chromosome abnormality, and many chromosome abnormalities are not compatible with life. So many of these babies will spontaneously abort. However, there are a few chromosome abnormalities that babies can live to birth. They don't always live long after birth. Some can live a few years after birth. So it just depends on what's going on. A fetal infection. What happens if maybe baby gets an infection in there? Maybe the amniotic sac was leaking a little bit and a little bit of bacteria got up inside there. So sometimes infection can cause that. Placenta infarcts. So remember that placenta is our lifeline, kind of that's getting all of our nutrients. If our placenta gets blood clots in it and it destroys parts of our placenta, then our placenta can't give the baby the nourishment that it needs. So sometimes we have something like that happen. Maybe mom's not eating like she should. Maybe mom, socially, economically, or whatever the case may be, maybe she can't afford the food. Maybe mom has anorexia nervosa and she's not eating the food. Maybe she has a fear of getting fat. So these are all things that we have to think about with mom, and we have to quiz mom and question mom when she comes in for those prenatal visits. Maternal hypertension. If we have hypertension, it constricts those vessels. And think about that hypertension. If we have hypertension pounding into us, it's going to be pounding into that baby too, causing some difficulties with baby. Preeclampsia also goes along with the maternal hypertension. Can be either can be mom already had hypertension before she became pregnant. Now she can have it superseded with preeclampsia. Maybe we have a mom whose blood pressure was fine. Now she comes in and she has blood pressure problems from preeclampsia. Maternal renal disease. Maybe mom's kidneys can't filter out what needs to happen. Mom's a smoker. We know that that constricts the vessels. Maternal illegal drug use. Tetrogen exposure. Maybe mom has been working someplace where there's a lot of tetrogens in the air. Maybe she has been exposed to certain tetrogens that she's not even aware of. Multi-fetal pregnancy. Many times, the placentas can only give so much, and sometimes the placenta, if it's trying to feed 3 babies, sometimes we can't get all of them fed to the best that the placenta can do. Usually, the first 3 months is where these babies are more susceptible to those external influences because that first 3 months is when everything is forming, everything is coming together. And if we have, like, mom gets a huge infection, mom gets something going on, mom takes some kind of tetrogen, that's going to affect the growth of that fetus. So that is very important when we're thinking about prenatal care and talking to mom. And a lot of times we haven't even seen these moms yet because they just found out they're pregnant. So it's important to ask them what they've done in the past so we can kind of be prepared for our future baby. So placenta and fetal circulation. This can get a little bit complicated, but I just want you to think about fetal circulation. Lungs don't work. So in the baby, the lungs do not work. So the baby, the heart the heart is still going to pump everything around in the baby, but it isn't really going to pump it into the lungs anymore. So it's going to bypass the lungs because the lungs don't need to work because mom is taking care of bringing in all the oxygen and taking all the carbon dioxide away. So baby doesn't have to do that. So the baby has what we call shunts inside there. It has 3 of them. A ductus venosus, it has a foramen of ovale, and it has a ductus arteriosus. Now, the first one diverts blood away from the liver. I don't really see a problem with this one a whole lot, but the 2 that I mainly talk about is the foramen of ovale. This is where there is a hole between the right atria and the left atria. So the right side of our heart has deoxygenated blood coming in it. The left side of our heart has oxygen in it. Well, there's a hole in between. So that blood's just going to mix. Oxygenated, deoxygenated, they're going to play together really good. Then we have this thing called the ductus arteriosus. And what's going to happen here, remember when the blood leaves the left ventricle, it goes into the pulmonary artery. It goes into the aorta. So when the ventricle contracts, it goes into the pulmonary, oh, wait a minute. I got to get my thoughts together here. When the blood comes into the right atria, goes to the right ventricle, shoots through the pulmonary artery. That pulmonary artery, we don't need that pulmonary artery right now. So we have this little ductus arteriosus that connects from the pulmonary artery to the aorta. So the blood goes between the atria of the heart, plus when it pumps through the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery, it shoots through that little ductus arteriosus to our aorta and completely bypasses those lungs. And that's important to know, especially when babies take their first breath, which we'll get to that a little bit later. So just kind of keep that fetal circulation in your mind. I don't think I have a picture of it. Yep, I do, right here. So here's your fetal circulation. It's not a super great picture, but you can kind of see, here's your ductus venosus. Here is your foramen ovale, where the two atria are connected. Here is your ductus arteriosus, where here it's coming out of your right ventricle, pulmonary artery, and see this little guy right here? That is your ductus arteriosus shooting it into our aorta, bypassing our lungs. So, oops, didn't mean to do that. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the ductus arteriosus. So what happens right after birth, or what's supposed to happen right after birth, is that foramen ovale should close, that ductus arteriosus should close. Sometimes they can stay open just a little bit, and sometimes we'll hear murmurs on babies, and a lot of times that's just because of the backflow of the blood coming in. Now, sometimes that can happen. Sometimes what can happen, these ducts will close. These babies take their first breath, and maybe their lungs aren't mature. Maybe their lungs aren't working like they should. So the babies get into respiratory distress, and that pressure in those lungs, they get real high pressure in their lungs, and it causes these ducts to reopen. We really don't like for that to happen, and that can cause lots and lots of problems with babies. So just know, right after delivery, as long as everything goes like it should, like it does probably 90% of the time, the babies take the deep breath, things shut down, babies start to breathe good. But if we have a baby that's premature, we have a baby that's born to a diabetic mom, we have a baby born to a mom with preeclampsia, sometimes those babies can develop some respiratory distress because their lungs aren't mature or their lungs aren't ready to start circulating yet. And we have to increase the pressure in their lungs to get blood flow through their lungs. When we increase that pressure, it can go and pop those back open. We don't like to see that happen, but it can happen. After our babies are born at 24 hours old, we do what we call a preductal and a postductal test. Every baby's going to get one. So remember how the preductal, when it comes in the right side of the heart, we're going to put that pulse ox on their right hand. We're going to get a reading, and we want it to be above 95. If it's above 95, then we're going to take it off and we're going to put it on either one of their feet. Doesn't matter. We're going to get a pulse ox there. That's our postductal. It has to be over 95 too. Both readings from the preductal and the postductal have to be within 3 of each other. So if you get a 95 and a 97, you're good. If you get a 95 and 100, it's a failure. Even though it's above 95, it's not within that 3. So we do that on every baby at 24 hours old. Okay, and I showed you that already. All right, so some special considerations that we want to think about. Tetrogens and the fetus. Tetrogens, remember, those are the bad things that we can get into that can cause the defects of our baby. Those are just substances that can cause defects. And the severity of those defects kind of depends on what development phase the baby was in, what body system was developing at the time. Was it the cardiovascular system? Was it neurological system? Was it the reproductive system? What was happening at that time? And so here's a few ways that mom can get those. So there's a few different types of tetrogens. One is ingested. So those are things that mom's going to swallow. One is infectious. Those are things that mom can be exposed to. And then we can get environmental. Those are just things that mom can come in contact with that she doesn't even know. So ingested, these are things we're going to take. Medications, over the counter, drugs, alcohol, anything that we can take. We've seen lots of babies recently being born with moms that have been taking methamphetamines. Some of the moms have been on the medications, methadone, to help them come off of it. Baby is still getting that methadone. So those are ingested. Those are things that mom takes in. During those prenatal visits, we tell mom, do not take any over-the-counter or prescription medications without letting your OB know what it is. And then we look at infections. So we know that varicella, we know that CMV, and we know that rubella can cause some major, major anomalies with our babies. If mom would contract varicella or rubella or CMV during that first 3 months, we know that those babies are going to be born with some type of congenital anomaly. We're not sure what it is, but they will definitely be born with something. These are tetragenic to our babies. Environmental things would just be like iodinizing radiation. Those can be like it can be in our soil. It can be any place, if you work someplace where they're using a lot of ionized, radioactive substances, mercury, certain chemicals, anything like that you've seen recently where that's why we tell moms not to eat a lot of seafood, because there can be mercury in that, and that can cause some fetal abnormalities. So we look at all of those types of things when mom is first pregnant. Also, that's why we tell moms not to have lunch meat and all of those types of things, because that can cause infections and that can be detrimental to those babies. Ectopic pregnancies, this is where the pregnancy happens someplace other than the fallopian tube. So when you think about where is that baby at, it can be someplace else. Now, these little zygotes can implant any place besides the uterus. They can actually implant outside the uterus. They can implant on the outside of the colon. They can implant someplace in the abdominal cavity. They're not going to go anywhere. They're not going to be able to grow because they're not inside the uterus. But that can happen. Most of these are going to occur in your fallopian tubes. And many times it's going to be because of scarring. It's going to be something that prevented that baby from getting through that tube. Maybe there was some scarring from a mom had a pelvic inflammatory disease and she had some scarring of her fallopian tubes. That can cause that. Maybe mom had some trauma and didn't even know this had occurred. So most of these are going to be in the fallopian tubes. Moms are usually going to present with severe lower right, left quadrant pain, and that's how they're going to present to the emergency room or to their doctor. It is the leading cause of death in that first trimester in most of our moms. So it is something that we have to be aware of and be thinking about pretty quickly. Also, moms that have more than one baby. So thinking about what types of twins or what kind of pregnancies that we have is if we have monozygotic. So monozygotic means one zygote. So these babies started from one cell and they split. They share everything the same. So their genetic makeup will be the same and their sex will be the same. Now, dizygotic twins, these are fraternal twins. They had two different zygotes that got fertilized. They genetically will not be the same and they may not be the same sex. Now, how do we classify twins? We have diamnionic and dichorionic. Di means two. So each are going to have their own amniotic sac, and the placentas do not share any vessels. So they have their own sac, they have their own placenta, they have everything their own. Now, diamnionic and monochorionic, where they have their own amniotic sac, but they share a common chorionic sac. So they have their own amniotic sac, but they have one big chorionic sac. They have a separate placenta, but the placentas share the same vessels. So they're going to kind of share everything as one. Monoamnionic and monochorionic, they have one amniotic cavity that they both share. So looking at this, here is you have the placenta. They each have a different placenta, and they each have their own stuff. They each have their own cords. They each have everything. Now, this one, they're sharing the same chorion, the same placenta, but they have different amniotic sacs here, and they have different vessels coming out of there. Okay. So what are some things that can cause multifetal pregnancies? Well, one is if you have a family history of twins. We know that some women will maybe, when they ovulate 2 eggs at a time. Maybe their right and their left ovulate at the same time, so they can get 2 that are fertilized. Maybe they've just stopped oral contraceptives, and their body's like, ooh, we got something new here. We're going to produce a lot of eggs. So maybe their mom, if a mom is taller in stature, African American heritage, and if they've had fertility use, we know that those are all going to increase that potential to have more than one baby. So if they have more than one baby, they're going to have there's going to be more complications, and we'll talk about those throughout the chapters. That is the end, and I hope you guys all enjoyed.